So now we're going to take the techniques that I just taught you and apply them to an actual plate shot and show you the flaws and so forth, and how good it works here and there in certain circumstances, and then show you how eventually we're going to need like techniques such as four-corner pinning and planar tracking to really get the job done. So I'm going to go ahead and hit R for read, and we're going to go to our antique shot 1 and bring in the image sequence. So I'm going to set my settings here to input and put my viewer to it, so you can see our frame range is 613 to 650 and so forth. So I'm going to find a frame where we get very close to the edge, which would be right about here. Okay, so go ahead and kind of get about right there. Okay, so I'm going to choose frame 683, so I'm going to hit S for settings, put my viewer here to the, or my cursor to the node graph, hit S for settings. I'm going to put my end frame range to 683, okay, and my beginning frame range. Of course, you could also hit I and O, letter I and letter O, so I can hit O. Oops, let me put that back to 613 for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of scrub until we get, let's go for 667. So 667. So with this set in my globals, all I have to do is come over here and hit global, and now that kind of comes in here. Now I can also just hit I and O, so I can hit the letter I and the letter O right here, so that'll set my frame range, and then I can always use my in and out. So depending on where my in and out is, I can just click in and out, or I can hit global. Okay, that's a nice little way. So let's see how many frames we got here. Maybe we'll want some more. I think we might not have enough frames for tracking here. That's looking good. I'm going to add just a couple more frames on the end, and actually let's go to input, in, back up. I usually use my middle mouse scroll wheel and put my cursor right here and just back up, and I will let's make this 687 and 662. So again, I'll put this to global. And you can move these by physically hitting your left, clicking, dragging your left mouse button on them to spread them out. And I'll just hit play so we can go ahead and cache the footage. So you can see we got some motion blur in here. The frame, there is distortion going. You can physically see it. Look at the antique sign. It's like kind of stretching from left to right. So again, certain techniques of using our trackers might not work in this circumstance. They would work if we were relatively keeping, if the shot consisted with the antique sign in the center of the frame, and the shot maybe ended like right there. But because we're getting near the edge of the frame, that's where we're going to start to see the ugly face of distortion. Now, we talked about it before, but we need to remove barrel lens distortion. We will still have distortion, but we have to get to the point where we don't have curve distortion. We discussed this before, where I talked about how barrel lens distortion has a curvy look to it. There's actually a curviness going on here along the edge. This is actually bowing. And then we remove that, we have perspective straight line distortion. What kind of distortion are we looking to get? Well, if I hit my tab button here in my viewer, this is a 3D space inside of Nuke. If I move around, and if you want to move around, my recommendation is, since we will be eventually in later courses working in Maya, you want to go in here under your preferences. So I'm going to go to Edit Preferences, and you're going to go here to your viewer. Let's see, it's usually, oh, here it is, Viewer Handles. And you want to put your 3D control type to Maya. It by default is usually set to Nuke, but I'm going to put it to Maya. So move around in the 3D space. You need to just go ahead and type Alt, hold down Alt, and click your left mouse button. If you hit Alt and right mouse button, it's zooming in and out, and Alt middle mouse button is kind of moving up and down. I want you to be aware, like in 3D space, we have these perfect straight perspective lines. That's the way the computer computes things. So we have to have that. Inside of shooting on a barrel lens in the real world, you'll have distortion that actually kind of curves around here. We still have distortion in here. Obviously, if I were to put a cube in the scene and we do what we did in Maya, you would still have that distortion where stretching, where it becomes a rectangle on the side. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Tab again to come back to our main footage. And we're going to go ahead and do some tracking. So let's go ahead and do that. And before we do that, we need to take out the lens distortion. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Tab and hit Read. And we're going to go ahead and want to get rid of some of this lens distortion. So if you kind of take a look here, there is some little tiny options here for checkerboards. Here's the 14mm Blackmagic Cinema Camera 4K checkerboard. It's a DPX. So I'm going to go ahead and open. So what is this all about? Well, let's go ahead and take a viewer to it. This is the actual bare lens distortion. The lens that we used here was a 14mm lens. Now that 14mm lens created this level of distortion. So you can see the bowed distortion. We need to get these lines straight. Okay, we will still have distortion in the sense of these cubes will be more rectangle on the outside, but we want to get rid of the barrel lens distortion, that curviness. So how do you do that? Well, you're going to go ahead and create a lens distortion node. Hit Tab and type lens distortion. And again, this was shot on an LCD screen. I usually take a 27-inch LCD screen, film a checkerboard on it, and make sure it's a flat LCD screen, not one of these new curved ones. And I just filmed it, and we are going to use that to figure out the lens distortion via the curve. It's going to analyze the image, and we're going to apply that to our footage. So I'm going to go ahead and put that to my lens distortion node. And if you go over here to line analysis, there's a grid analysis. And under grid analysis, we're going to choose thin line. There is checkerboard, but it is a little glitchy. I'm going to hit thin line and hit analyze grid. And look at that. Isn't that amazing? Let's go ahead and take a look at it. If you take a look roughly close here, you could see the difference in the distortion, right? It's still, you know, we're still getting a little bit of stretching. This here, I mean, we have perfect perspective straight lines now, but we have this here. This looks more like a rectangle. I know it's hard to show you, but this is more of a rectangle, whereas this is more square. You see the difference between this cube and this cube? It's very subtle, but there is a kind of stretchiness to the outside cubes and so forth. So just be aware of that. Now we can apply this by unplugging our source and plugging it into the footage. And now we have this here where it stretches the footage out. You'll see we have our bounding box stretching out a little bit further. This is a 4K file, by the way, so it's pretty big. But you can see what's happened here. We've now stretched the footage out, and if I wanted to, I could physically see what happened if I type, you know, I can come in here and make a transform node, right? And what if we were to take, there is data hidden behind here, so if I go ahead and take my scale and start to bring it down, put my viewer to this, you would start to see what has happened here. So I'll go ahead. It's been stretched. You see that? So if I'll disable this. So this footage had to be stretched, and the footage is actually extended out. So we're going to have to deal with that later to actually re-distort or re-barrel lens distort the footage. And that's what this is all about. We will be using this over and over and over again. And the way you can do it is you can turn a lens distortion node, or in this case, a lens undistort node. Go ahead and name it that. You can turn this thing into a redistort node by taking the actual node, copying and pasting it. So go ahead and copy this guy. And I'm going to rename it Redistort. And if I turn off this undistort button, it inverses the effect. So I'll go ahead and plug it through here. And look at that, we're back. Now, I'm going to take this footage and put this footage as my second viewer. So I'm going to click in here and click 1. And then click on this node and hit 2. And then just go back and forth. You can see there is no difference between this node and this node. So this took out the distortion, and then this added the distortion. Now, why would we ever add the distortion? Well, we're going to use this node for later to actually distort any CG or anything that we need to add distortion to. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you work. Okay, this is going to be very important when we get into 3D tracking and all that fun stuff. But for now, we've taken out the undistorted plate, and we're going to go ahead and just play around here and add in our trackers. So I'm going to go ahead and add a tracker now, and now I'm going to track the footage that is undistorted. because we have removed not distortion, but we have removed barrel lens distortion, that curviness. So I'm sorry if I'm kind of belaboring this, but I really want you guys to understand what I'm talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to go to frame 687. You know what? Let's change our frame range a little bit. It looks like we got chopped off at the edge there. So I'm going to choose frame 681 as my last frame. So again, I'll hit S for settings, and I'll change this to 681. There we go. And again, you could just set this to global if you want. Now we're back, so to speak. So there's not many frames for us to track here. In fact, yeah, I think we'll be okay though. Okay, so let's go ahead and do a tracking, and I'm going to go ahead and hit a tracker, add a tracker here, and let's start tracking something with contrast. This is very hard to track, but it is a point that has contrast. You can see in this square here, if I go ahead and bring down the brightness value here, I could physically put this point here, and that's a unique shape in the midst of the search index area. So is that shape showing up somewhere else? Well, it could come over here, but this is a unique shape too, right? So again, what you see in this little square here is the image we're going to be looking for in the next frame, and the next frame, and the next frame. So kind of keep that. Also, be aware that sometimes when you move around an object, the actual shape of the object changes. And in doing so, you could also come over here and say, set a new keyframe every frame or every nth frame, which will basically reprint or re-update what the image is that is changing. The bad news is that we can get what's called drifting. Again, this is for a further discussion in more advanced courses, but I'm just kind of keeping it where it is. So let's go ahead and just track this right here and kind of save ourselves some work. I'm going to go ahead and add another track. And let's go ahead and put it over here. Right there. And let's add another track. Again, just adding tracks here. And again, we are on a middle frame here. I have a frame on 672. We have keyframes on there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then I'll have an add track. And again, we can get these nice L shapes, which are great for what we need to do. So now I can, if I click this track and hold down Shift to grab all four at once, I can go ahead and track them forward. So I'll go ahead and track forward. See, it's taking a little bit longer, obviously. And because I didn't put a frame range, it actually went over, which that's okay. I'm only dealing with this area. This is where I would use my track backwards range. And then you could see from 672 to what? Well, 662. You can dial it in and hit OK. That way you know it stops. Otherwise, you're going to have to hit cancel. Okay. So with that said, we can go ahead and use this information for many things. Tracker 1 is here. And then I'll use, I'm going to go ahead and turn to tracker 2. I'll turn off evaluate all these. I don't want these to change or nothing as far as if we decide to retrack any information, but we're not, I don't think we're going to. It looks like a pretty solid tracks. So I'm going to go to my tracker 1 here, leave it to translate, tracker 2, leave it to rotate, and let's see if we can, we'll use this one for rotate and scale. Let's try that. Okay, so only this tracker 1 and this tracker 2 are going to be used. It's going to be based on the distance of each one, and we'll see how it looks. So with that said, I'm going to take my tracker, and we're going to export out a transform match move. And I'll hit create. What's important in the midst of all of this is just being aware of that you're going to have to do an offset rotation on this. So I'm going to take this antique GIF here and click it. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit M for merge. And I'm going to merge the plate. And again, this is going to be the lens undistort plate because that's what we tracked based on, right? And then transform match move. Let's go ahead and put the viewer to it and see what we get. All right. So one thing I want to do, obviously, just be safe, is hit S for settings and set my footage to the size of the frame here, which is obviously the full-size format, which is 4000 by 2160. You'll see it as an actual drop-down way at the bottom, so you can see it's 4000 by 2160. And there's our general store. If I go ahead and move it around, it's physically moving, scaling, and rotating. So I'm going to go ahead and physically move this into place. So I'm going to take my transform, and let's move that into place, shall we? So I will take make another transform node just before this, and stick it over here. And I'll go ahead and rotate it like that, just for the heck of it. Let's just see how things are going here. The scale is looking pretty good. Is it solving the issue in regards to lens distortion? Maybe, we don't know, because if there is stretching going on, but again, we're having stretching, up here and off to the side, so just 2 points might not be enough, but 3 points might do it. But you can start to see how this is starting to stick on the scene, which is awesome. Now the only problem with this is that we have a issue where it needs to have a sort of a skew or perspective, because it's actually kind of it should have a distortion. So I need to be able to kind of play with that. So what you can do is add what's called a corner pin. So I'm going to add a corner pin, and at this point I'm going to get rid of this transform node, and I'm just going to put the corner pin in right there. Now the corner pin, obviously, if you see, here's my general thing, and I just start playing with it, it's like, whoa, what's going on here, huh? Well, put your viewer to the corner pin node, which is just before the actual general store. And you can see the data here. It says it's reading off the from, right, to the corner pin information here, right here. So you can see the from is here. So if I say set to input, okay, it puts the points to the actual physical size. And then if I go to the corner pin 2D, I'm going to say copy from, and now the points you can see are at different values. In this case, it's 0, 0, which is down here, 800, 0, okay, which is here, right, 800, 354, and then 0, 354. So again, it's a simple operation of saying set to input, coming over here and saying copy from. Now you can see I can actually pull from this. So I'm going to go back and put my viewer to the merge node. And now I can come in here and I can grab all these if I want. I don't have to, I can lasso grab them like this. And just bring them over here. And let's get that into place in our sign. Alright, so I'm going to stay inside the white border here as much as possible here. It's hard to see the border. I'm guesstimating perspective as I kind of tweak these points. But in general, I get a general store. Now, at this point, you might see this looks a little stretched as far as the original image, but that's okay. I'm just using this example for today. And now I can go ahead and play. If you want to, you can hover over your viewer and hit the Q for display to hide the points. And now you can see we have a general store in here. There's no motion blur. The actual color correction doesn't make sense. But already you can start to see an issue in the tracking here, right? See how it's not scaling correctly? You see that? Now why is that? What's the case for that? Well, if I come over here to my actual tracker, right, and hit Q to bring back my overlays, you will see that I'm only using a tracker here and a tracker here. These are, their distance from each other is establishing the actual scale. So something is off. So I can actually use, in this case, tracker 3. Let's try tracker 3. So I'm going to turn off the rotation and translation of tracker 2, and now all you get is a physical translation. So you can see if I hit play, all it's doing is translating. It's not taking in the case of scale or anything. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and switch that out. And I'm going to choose tracker 3, which is kitty corner from tracker 1. And we hit rotation and scale. So you see it kind of like buds up and works there. Let's see how that works. So I'll go ahead and just let it play through. I'm going to hit the letter Q to hide all my overlays twice. Sometimes you got to hit it twice. You can see I have overlay on, no animation. Just letting it kind of play through. Not bad, but there is probably still a little sliding, and this is where you have to be aware of things in regards to tracking and so forth. This is a perfect example of how this technique will not work, okay, in this specific circumstance, because we're getting a distortion bend up here, we're getting a distortion bend up here, and that's just the way it is. But we can create what's called a corner pin. Okay, we have 4 points tracked, right? I can go ahead and say export out and use a corner pin 2D. So you can see we have, use current frame. So let me just go ahead and find a frame that I like for placing, like 665, whatever. And I'm just going to do corner pin and say use current frame and say create. And it says you need 4 points. So I'll go ahead and turn on all these. And I'll just make sure I have them evaluated like that. There we go. So upon that, I'm going to say corner pin 2D, use current frame, create. And it says corner pin export needs exactly 4 tracks selected. So I'm going to grab all 4. And I'm going to click create. Now I have this corner pin 2D. I'm going to get rid of my match move. I'm going to plug that in. Okay, now let's take a look what we get. And hit play. Now obviously the placement needs some work, so I'm going to come to the corner pin here and hit Q for overlay. And let's go ahead and move these points. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit play. I'll full frame this by hitting spacebar and hitting H, so I can full frame it and back up a little bit with my middle mouse scroll wheel back. And I'll hit Q to hide over the overlays, so I don't have to see them. So there you go. That is a nice reality, but not all the time do we have points to represent, corner pinning. So you don't always get this lucky to actually get this in. What if the footage kind of fell off the frame, right? What if we had to continue this shot through and have this general store kind of leave the frame? Well, if that's the case, then we'd have to get into 3D tracking. But overall, I think the next step at this point is to do a little bit of color correction on here. So we could come in here and just add a grade node before the corner pin. And I could start playing. I'm going to do a very rough color correction here. We're going to get into color correction a little bit later here. But I'm going to play with my blacks. Play with my whites. And I will go ahead and add a little bit of gain with some green color here. Just a little bit of green. I'm going to probably desaturate the image just a bit. So I'll take a saturation node and stick it right here. And finally, if you take a look at the corner pin, the physical corner pin that actually does the animation, not your corner pin of placement, but your corner pin, you want to turn on motion blur by just upping the motion blur value and putting your shutter offset to centered. And now you have motion blur. You can adjust the amount of motion blur by the shutter. The more shutter, the more blur. So you have to judge your plate shot and see how motion blur is affecting the rest of the image and use your best judgment to get that going. I did a really rough job on the color correction here, just so you know. But in general, it's looking really good for a starter. And that basically is corner pinning and the flaws of using the traditional tracking system, which work in certain circumstances, But in this circumstance, because of lens distortion, which I want to make visible to you because it is an invisible artifact, works best in corner pin and eventually as I get into 3D tracking. One last thing that I wanted to talk about was, of course, the Redistortion node. Now, what you could do in this circumstance is at the last frame here, you can see if I put my viewer to this merge node, we still have the original data kind of coming down the pipeline of the bounding box of the original footage that's been undistorted. So we can actually add a redistort on here and go ahead and render it out here, and now we have the footage redistorted. Now, due to the idea of concatenation, which we're going to get into later, which for every single time we take an image and manipulate it, such as, you know, for instance, such things as lens undistortion. If we take a look here, there's a filtering going on. Every time you kind of move something around, you basically put it through a filtering, which kind of adds a little bit of maybe blurring, so to speak, or maybe sharp contrast. But it's basically almost a degradation of the image. So you can see here at the lens undistort, you know, it's set to cubic. There's different options that are that you can play with, and again, we'll discuss this later on. But every time you manipulate an image and you remove it around, you're re-sampling the image. So you can see we're taking a hit there, and then lens distortion, lens and redistort here, we're doing it again. So if I take a look at this footage and I look at the original footage, let's see if there's any loss of quality. And you do see something going on. You can see it. See it? There's something changing from the original footage. Look for like high contrast areas here to the original, to this footage. It's so subtle, but you see how it's a little bit different. So be aware there is something going on. There's a little bit of a quote-unquote degradation of the image as we kind of go through this. And to avoid that, what we can do is we can take the lens distortion node, and we're going to go ahead and, again, we're going to continue to, you know, undistort it, but instead of having our B input for the lens undistort, we're actually going to add a constant. So I'll just type in tab and type constant. And I'll take a look at the constant node, and we're going to make sure the format is set to 4000 by 2160. If I click this little 4 here, you'll see that the value is red color 0, green 0, blue 0, and then alpha 0. So there's no alpha in here, as you can see here. I'll go ahead and put it to alpha. So it's basically transparent. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in for the B. And what we get at this merge node, obviously, if I hit A for alpha, while I put my cursor over here, is I have an alpha like transparent image. It still has the motion blur and so forth, but it's there. And now I can take that footage, and then as it goes through the lens redistort, it actually re-squeezes the image down, as you can see here. In this case, as you can see, it squeezed it down. And now I can go ahead and take that and hit M for merge, and put this as the A for a top, and for the background input, we're not going to choose the lens undistort, we're going to choose the original plate footage, because that's what we're doing. We're actually basically adding the barrel lens distortion, and then pretty much putting the footage, the CG object back onto here. So let's go ahead and take a look. So voila. So if I take a look at this merge node and then put my viewer to the original plate shot, the degradation of the image hasn't changed much at all here, as you can see, between this footage. Obviously, this is an additional element that's been put in here. It could use a edge blur and all that, but we're not dealing with it now. I'm just kind of giving you a basic composition here. You can see that we've saved the quality of the image just by putting this stuff onto the original plate shot. So there's always that kind of mindset in the background that as we move an object, transform an object, we are basically resampling the object, hence what I like to call blurring it, or giving it a little bit of difference between the original plate shot. Not much, but it is there. So that's pretty much it for this section. We're going to get into a little bit more on the understanding of other techniques such as planar tracking in our next lessons.